Copyright University of Auckland, all rights reserved. The content and delivery of lectures in this course are protected by copyright. Material belonging to others may have been used in these lectures and copied by and solely for the educational purposes of the university under licence. You may record the lectures for the purposes of private study or research, but you may not sell, alter or further reproduce or distribute any part of these lectures to any other person. Failure to comply with the terms of this warning may expose you to legal action for copyright infringement by the copyright owner and/or disciplinary action by the university.
So, Maureen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, welcome everybody. I guess some of you know each other, maybe all of you do. How many are students at Auckland? How many staff at Auckland? Anyone from outside the university today? Okay, good. That's a nice mix. Well, I don't need much persuading to come to New Zealand, although it is a long way. And I live in the north of England, so it's an even longer way. And it's very cold there, and it's surprisingly warm in New Zealand, even down in Christchurch, which was a bit of a surprise to people, and Wellington, hence getting sunburned at the top of Mount Sunday on Saturday. But today, as JC says, I want to talk about resilience and a slightly provocative title, which is how to make it work, because I don't think it does or has done particularly yet, unless you want to persuade me otherwise. Not at least in the way that we've come to conceptualize it after looking at it on our project. So, a bit of scene setting about why I chose the title, and what I think is wrong and right about resilience. And then a bit of background on that, and then the Embrace project, which is primarily what I'm here to talk about, but then exploring how to make resilience work at this organization and community interface, because our research shows that there's some tension there, and it's an area worth exploring. I should also say that I'm here at the support from the British government, who are part of an initiative to develop more UK-New Zealand research links. So I'm interested in not just telling you what we've done in Europe, but it's more to say, well, this is what we've done, what can we now learn from you? And are there spaces where we might bring those two research traditions together and come up with some interesting proposals that develop, say, our research on Embrace and yours in whatever field it might be. So ultimately, that's what we hope to get out of this. So setting the scene, why I chose the title. When we started this project, the Embrace project, we started thinking, once we found out we'd got the money, oh no, resilience, it's so complicated. And 4 years later, we ended up thinking, resilience, it's so complicated. So we had more questions, I think, after 4 years working on this project than we had answers. And I think that's still an ongoing process. When we started, we had certain ideas about breaking new ground in conceptualizing resilience, which over the 4 years, I would say, has become more of a consensus. And I'll say a bit more about that. So in terms of what does resilience mean, I mean, there is some, there are some turf wars from people who've kind of captured it in particular ways. But I think we've generally got the idea that it's not business as usual, it's not the same old thing, it's a bit more complicated than that. I think it's a problem that The concepts have grown exponentially in their complexity at the same time as the organizations have struggled to deal with that, and particularly in a European context and wider than that, I think, in a context of austerity, economic austerity. So a shrinking service base, let's say, all the time we're demanding more of them. So we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. What's wrong with the concept? Well, we could spend the next 2 hours just talking about that, maybe. And I'm very well aware that you mentioned the word "at your peril" in Christchurch, because it has been captured, I would say, by various people. It's been appropriated. It's been reduced in many ways. It's often been applied in a very instrumentalist and narrow way. And it speaks to a rather neoliberal political agenda, which seeks to put responsibility onto communities for their own vulnerability reduction and resilience building, at the same time as they don't give them authority or equal partnerships in doing the necessary work. So there are major problems with the concept, I think. I'll let you, in the second part, discuss what some of those things might be in your smaller groups. And I'm sure it will crop up as I talk to you. What's right with it? I still do think it's a project worth pursuing. I still do think that there is potential in the resilience context to move away from some of the negatives that have come out of the vulnerability approach. And I'm a long-term adherent and supporter of a vulnerability approach, but in a particular way, and that's vulnerability as constructed vulnerability, as marginalization, not vulnerability as weakness and passivity, which is how it's often represented. The vulnerable. It's a label that you put on people. Now, the resilient is a label you put on people, as if it's something you can just, you are and you can carry around with you, when in fact, resilience and vulnerability are quite contingent. There are all sorts of contexts for how you may move in and out of those kinds of states, or in fact be both simultaneously in different ways. That comes up very particularly in the gender context, gender and disaster context, where you will always be hearing that women are the most vulnerable group, and there is evidence that, yes, worldwide more women die than men in disasters. You can find some statistics on that. But women aren't the most vulnerable group all the time, and not all women. So that's also quite contextual. So resilience allows us to potentially move forward in a developmental sense. It does have this drawback, though, that, as I say, it's being captured. If you are a government, say, if you're at that level, if you have a group in your society who are labeled vulnerable, there's almost a moral imperative that you do something about it. If you have a group and you call them resilient, that allows you to step back because they can take care of themselves. So there is a risk in this this word, this label. Let's talk about how we got to where we got to with this. Let me just ask you, first of all, what do you think? What makes communities resilient? What kinds of things make communities resilient, would you say? Yeah. Sorry. Yes. Connectedness, yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Connections. Uh-huh. Okay. Connectedness, participation, understanding. Yeah. Affluence, right? Resources and... You mentioned risk, but we were just talking about communities being resilient. Now, if we say specifically what makes communities disaster resilient, does that change what you would say? If I approached you with the question as disaster resilience initially, would you have said something else? Or is it the same thing? You see, I think that is a movement forward in general thinking about resilience, and particularly about disaster resilience, which formerly was constructed in quite a narrow, disaster-focused way. But I wonder, is it possible to separate then disasters from the everyday? It sounds from what you're saying that it's pretty connected. What makes a community resilient to what? Economic change or any kind of disturbance is the same as what makes them disaster resilient. Yeah.
Well, I think that reflects on the debate that we should, or there has been a strong focus on the big disasters, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, but the everyday little things which can be as disastrous for the individual anymore, have been sort of, not received enough attention. So
Yeah.
I think, from my perspective, it would be decided, and it is possible, whether it's necessary. You don't. Well, do you have to separate them? You don't really, as long as you pay attention to that. I think you don't necessarily need to separate a lot of concepts and ideas, ideas.
Depends who you are and what your mandate is. So if you are part of emergency management, disaster management, and you're charged with facilitating community disaster resilience, then chances are you're going to be funneled in quite a narrow way, because what can you do about affluence or connectedness, or it isn't part of your mandate. And I think that's the tension. Certainly in Europe, I would say, and certainly in the UK, the tension that we're in at the moment of knowing it's bigger than we thought originally and not really knowing what we do with it. How do we make it work? I hope you come up with all the answers afterwards, and I can go home and give it to them and say, oh, problem solved. And I think that that potential to separate disaster on the large scale from the everyday is problematic, and therefore it does influence how we might go about making interventions. But if it's disaster resilience we're talking about, then often the starting point is civil protection or civil defense or emergency management, blue light services, Google's view of civil protection. I don't see that chiming much with what you just said about community disaster resilience, and that's just putting in community disaster resilience into Google. That's putting in civil protection into Google. And civil protection are at the front line of responding to, planning for disasters, but maybe not recovering from. In the UK context, our UK Cabinet Office, close to the Prime Minister level, there is a lexicon, there is the official dictionary of terms, and that's what they have to say about civil protection and about resilience. So, anything strike you about those?
Responsible to complement the response of emergency services.
Uh-huh.
As the dangers are
Yes. Not possible, not desirable from some perspectives. So you can see this comes very much from a top-down view of how you would manage this problem area. And this has been the tradition in the UK particularly, elsewhere in Europe, but particularly in the UK. And we are in a transitional stage of moving through that somewhat uncomfortably, I'd say. So even when you look at community resilience, it's still complementing the response of the emergency services. It doesn't have a lot to do with what you were saying community resilience meant. We wanted to go beyond civil protection in looking at community disaster resilience in the Embrace project. We decided not to come up with our own definition, and we settled on the IPCC resilience definition. A couple of us have been involved in the IPCC process anyway, so we were okay with taking that and working with it. And what we liked was the last part of that, the capacity for adaptation, learning, and transformation. We also liked, this chimed with how we were approaching resilience initially and subsequently, the breadth of it, the social, economic, environmental systems, so looking quite broadly. So the question we struggled with was, how do you build community disaster resilience in a developed country context? The hazard management, civil protection starting point inevitably focuses on hazard and disaster management. Then, of course, we get increasingly the inclusion of communities themselves, and recognized now as being a necessary inclusion in that stakeholder list. But we found, and I'll talk through the project so you can see how we kind of got to that point, but we found that if we're talking about community disaster resilience, civil protection, hazard management can only do so much. And communities, although they are at the heart of this issue, can only do so much. And we found, and it was tested empirically, we found that what you also needed was this underpinning layer of social protection. So you had civil protection and social protection and communities, and all going through this continuous reflective process of social learning. That's almost, not quite that well defined, but that's almost where we started, and pretty much was supported in our empirical work. Because also when we started 4 years ago, there was a lot of talk about resilience, a lot of theorizing and less empirical work. So we wanted to bring those two together and carry out empirical work to test is probably too hard a term. For a lot of what we did was qualitative, not all of us, but a lot of it. So as I said at the start, the context for all of that was also this context of economic austerity, cuts, as we think of them in the UK, economic cuts, which had reduced the possibilities of this social protection layer that we were seeking. So there's a policy point to be made that you cannot dispense with that by shifting responsibility onto community members, because they are still dependent on that social protection layer for a number of things. So we'll return to that. So let me tell you something about the project. 2011 to 2015, we finished at the end of September last year. You've got some information there that 11 partner institutions across Europe, and many outputs. Our final output, our substantive output, is not there yet. We have a contract with Wiley to produce a book, which is in process now, and that will capture what we've done. There is an email list, a disaster resilience email list. If you Google disaster resilience and JISC mail, J-I-S-C-M-A-I-L, JISC mail, it will pop up. I'm not sure how many at the moment, around 400 or so. Last time I looked, I'm not sure. Quite an interesting list with some interesting discussions on it. But what we were really charged with was coming up with some kind of framework that had a degree of buy-in from people in terms of what is community disaster resilience. We were quite a diverse group of academics from various disciplines and traditions, so our range of methods was quite broad. And we also worked across multiple scales. Some of us doing quantitative survey work, which was, although it was building towards an aggregate in a community, was very much at the individual level, and others of us starting at that community or societal level. We carried out 5 case studies across Europe. Earthquakes in Turkey, heat waves in London, river flooding in Central Europe, alpine hazards in Italy, and the case I'll talk to you about briefly today is flooding in northern England. So just as a snapshot, when we wanted to see, well, what were the key issues that emerged from the case studies, it mapped quite well onto what we were hoping would come out as significant issues. Resources and capacities are extremely important across the board, really, and so were social networks, and you picked up on both of those. Experience always comes up in the hazard theoretical literature, but I think it depends what you mean by experience and how people use that experience. So experience is important, but you still need to interrogate it to understand exactly why and how. Scale issues come up all the time. If you were to ask, well, if you were to ask New Zealand whether it were resilient, it might come up with one question, and a major disaster, such as the Canterbury sequence of earthquakes, might cause a bit of a blip, a downward blip. But essentially, New Zealand is relatively resilient. If you drop down to a community level, you might actually get a much deeper trough. And certainly at the individual level, that will can drop down further. And I think it's not often brought into the picture. People don't consider at what scale they're really addressing this issue, and the answers can be very different. It can also be very different at the same scale, depending on who you are. And you could pluck out of the particular context we happen to be talking about, which social groups might be more or less resilient and come through a disaster in very different ways. There are lots of other issues that we could bring up, but just broadly. So the framework itself, we envisaged it really as a continuous knot, a loop. We didn't want to prioritize one domain over another, and we wanted to see it all as really quite interconnected and continuous. And there were hundreds of different versions of what our framework would look like, and hundreds of hours of discussion to get to that point. And even now, every time I look at it, I want to change it, because your thinking goes on. So any kind of conceptualization is a capture in a particular time and place, and context can change how you might represent that. But we're reasonably happy with the kind of the canvas that it covers. So we split it into these three main domains: resources and capacities, actions, as we called it broadly, and learning. But also we wanted to emphasize that it's very much influenced by outside forces, by the context we're talking about, whether we're talking about Christchurch or Fiji or Northern England. The level of disturbance and the type and frequency of change. And those can be they could be economic change, they could be all sorts of changes, political change, they could be conflict. We also wanted to emphasize the importance of the form of disaster risk governance, whatever that might be in the particular context we were addressing. It may be laws, but it may just be responsibilities, expected responsibilities. The policies that are in place, all of those are going to affect a level of community resilience. The resources and capacities, we drew upon a sustainable livelihoods approach, the assets pentagram really, because we wanted to point up this message that community disaster resilience isn't just about the blue light services going in and rescuing, and some hazard awareness before or after. We wanted to paint this much more complex picture. And we wanted to bring in that blue actions loop, not just the civil protection, but social protection. I mean, arguably, when I look at it now, I want to make another loop that is just social protection to point that up. But it's actions that can be taken or not by those with the power to do so. So that's our image of embrace. So yes, in 2011, some of the ideas were quite radical, particularly in terms of not so much the theory and more the practice of, well, how are we going to actually make that happen? The sustainable livelihoods approach comes and goes in popularity. DFID, the Department for International Development in the UK, was a real champion of it formerly. Then it dropped out of view for a while, but now it's back again. And of course, you will have seen the same kind of thing appearing in Sarah's imagining of community resilience in Christchurch, or I should say Canterbury. So just briefly, the one little bit of our UK case study, which is in northwest England, in the Lake District, Cumbria. We'll just look at Keswick. Anybody been to Keswick? It's in the National Park in the UK. Lake District National Park has a very small resident population, but it gets 16 million visitors over the year. So it's quite a particular place, but it doesn't have a very large population, and the population it does have is skewed towards older people, which is a problem when you want to shift all your responsibility for managing disaster risk reduction to the community level. So this is where it is. So this is Keswick, up in the northwest of England. We looked at the Derwent catchment. We looked from the mountains to the sea. We did research particularly in Keswick, in Cockermouth, and in Workington. They're three very different places, not very far apart at all, but three very different places with different kinds of outcomes. I can't talk to you about the detail of those today. We don't have time, but you can find some of it in the reports we've written. So the 2009 floods were the last major disaster when we started this project. And that hit Cumbria very badly, and our three towns, amongst others, particularly badly. And there was record-breaking rainfall there at the time, and the rain had been coming for quite a while, so the land was saturated, which, given also the topography, given the kind of soils, given the land management in that upland farming region, meant that there was a massive amount of water just sheeting off the hillsides and into the towns. So what drainage infrastructure and flood defense infrastructure there was overwhelmed. These are the sorts of numbers. So we had sort of 2,250 properties flooded. 80% of those were residential and 20% retail and commercial. So it hit the local businesses, and most of those are quite small, actually, quite small businesses. Lots of schools forced to close. Big problem with the infrastructure and bridges collapsing. And that caused all sorts of problems for communities when they couldn't get, I mean, Workington is a case in point. They could see the other side of the river and they couldn't get to it without a huge detour. So people's lives were changed quite a bit at that time. And we had a death of a police constable. It's very unusual for people to die in extreme events in the UK. We do have deaths and fatalities, but it's unusual. So yes, all of the kinds of things you would be expecting, and the numbers just don't convey what people went through at the time. So on a global scale, you could say that the numbers were quite low, but the economic costs were very high. This is an area now that is becoming more costly and costly to the insurance industry. Apart from the economic costs, the psychological scars are very prevalent. And that is despite, in Kesik's case, Kesik is regarded as quite a beacon of community resilience. They're highly organized. They have a really excellent flood action group. And they've had floods before, so it grew out of previous floods. And the flood action group is populated by people who have been flooded. And they have been very strong advocates. And they've really done their homework in terms of the risk. They've become pretty expert in what the problems are, and you see that in these kinds of flood action groups that develop. They become quite expert. It also has another group of volunteers there who don't flood, because you can be in a flood action group, but if your house is flooding, then you've got other priorities. So they have a group of volunteers who don't flood, but can turn out to support those who are flooded at the time. So it's pretty well organized. And the residents are very knowledgeable. Many of them have taken costly individual so-called resilience measures or resistance measures to their houses, trying to keep water out or trying to reduce the damage if water comes in. And we're talking about tens of thousands of pounds worth of resilience measures. We're not just talking about a few £1,000 going and putting some covers on air bricks and low down in houses. We're talking about quite substantial work to houses. It's also, as I said, it's in the national park. It's a tourist town. And in order to protect those areas at flood risk, they didn't want to have solid walls that would interfere with the view of the river and the mountains. And so they developed quite an innovative design, this one, with a glass top to the wall. It's very strong glass. They also provided sort of individual things at the local level. They handed over, this picture at the bottom is the handing over of some extra surface water pumps. So in those locations that can't be served by that flood defense measure, they can do some individual level pumping. And that actually is a significant step forward in terms of community organization, let's say, trust and relationships to hand over to a community to do that kind of work. There's lots of stories around that, which I don't have time to go into. However, last December, we've had about 5 named storms in a very short space of time in the UK. Storm Desmond came along and overtopped those defences. They didn't break, the glass didn't break. People were worried that it might, but it didn't. But the event was so extreme, there was so much water. So the previous record was broken again. So this community did much more than most to prepare and to build their resilience. But the costs of these floods, for example, not just in Keswick, but we're talking more broadly, are going to be, well, we don't really know yet, but £5 billion, so $10 billion, and that's a billion, not a million. So we're talking about significant sums this time. And so that's why it really underlines this issue that extreme events, they always require more than this kind of technical solution, technical intervention. But it also underlines to me that each of these individual groupings can only do so much. And who's to know what the next extreme event might be? Is this an upward trend, and the next one will be bigger still? So we have this problem, not just us, but that extreme events have challenged the old certainties. And we think that our framework has captured some of those major domains that need to be considered when you're thinking in terms of community resilience. So the community resources and capacities were a very important part of the message we wanted to give. But there's a second level around that. So it depends who you are and what and who you know, and what and who you regard as trustworthy. It depends where you are. It's quite different whether you're in the urban areas, not that Keswick, Cockermouth and Workington are particularly urban on a global scale, but they are urbanized, and their world is quite different from the world of the very remote hamlets and villages and the world of the upland farmers, say. All of those things are going to make a difference. Whose knowledge counts when you're trying to decide what is the problem? At the moment, there's a debate raging about what is the cause of the flooding. And a lot of local people in Keswick, for example, think that a major contributing factor to the amount of water that came down the rivers and into their streets and houses was to do with the management of Thirlmere Reservoir, which is managed by United Utilities water company, and provides water, actually, is a water provider to Manchester and industrial areas further down. So if you are United Utilities, you need to keep a certain amount of water in that reservoir to service your customers. If you're living in Keswick, you want that reservoir to be practically empty at the beginning of a flood season, so that it's going to capture all of that water coming off the hillsides. But what impact would that make? What is where is the evidence? What is the research? Who's got the hydrological data that will tell us how much of a difference it would make? So whose knowledge counts? Is it the local people who think this is the case and they've always lived there and this is how it always was, so therefore this must be the answer to the problem? Or is the answer somewhere else? And that's a power issue. It's a power issue, it's a trust issue, it's a respect issue. Who is giving you that information? Do you believe them? Do you trust them? Do you respect them? If there's been a previous occurrence and trust has broken down, then you've got a problem in challenging heartfelt understandings of what the problem is. The place attachment. This is the Lake District. People have moved in because of that landscape, that environment very particularly. So what you can do with it to reduce risk is somewhat limited by that. Yes, all of those kinds of things. The communities themselves. People think of that as very homogeneous, a community, when in fact they're not. They're heterogeneous. So there is this growing, complicated picture, and people have a sense that yes, resilience is complex, it's complicated. We need to bring all these things together. We need to integrate and collaborate. That's definitely in the rhetoric, but who does it well, and how, if that's the case, do they do that? How can you integrate those kinds of different disciplines, different departments, different budget lines? The budget's always important. All of those factors. You've also got increasing fragmentation in management and silo working. People are under pressure to deliver what they always did deliver with a much reduced staff workforce. So the possibilities for broadening out and taking on more are much reduced. Delivering outputs at the expense of outcomes. So people don't really think about the impact of what they're going to do. They follow the mandate of their office, their department, whatever it might be, their particular responsibility, and tick the boxes. It doesn't necessarily lead to the outcome of community resilience that we were seeking. And the role of communities, of course, to protect themselves now, this shift of responsibility onto communities, but it's highly constrained by this complex web of resources. Who is the community? People rarely ask who is the community. In Keswick, for example, the large amount of work has been done by people who are not born and bred in Keswick necessarily. They're off-comers or people who've moved into the area. Many of them highly educated, relatively affluent, at or near retirement age, so many of them have some time to give to this kind of work. That's a bit of a caricature. Sorry, friends in Keswick, but you know what I mean. But when you look at Keswick, they're a small part of it. What about the other parts of it? What about, say, working class Keswick locals? You won't see them in the meetings. You won't see them in the same pubs. You won't see them in the same shops. You won't see them because they're holding down 3 or 4 part-time jobs, trying to make ends meet. So they're not necessarily an active part of this resilience creation. So we made a particular effort to look beyond the usual suspects, thinking we were going to find considerable hardship and increased vulnerability, etc. What we found actually was that, for example, in the small areas of social housing, so people who don't own their own homes, they're renting from a housing association, we expected them to have come through it very badly, and in fact many of them came through it very well, because the social protection that had been provided really worked. The housing association did a really good job. People were very efficiently and effectively moved in and out of their house as it was repaired and redecorated. And people we spoke to didn't have a bad word to say. So that rather turned on its head what we were expecting. But it did reinforce this importance of this underlying social protection. So the diversity in the community, who they were, was very important. Again, can't go into all the details. But what came out was one size doesn't fit all. It's quite a complex picture. But then you get to this question. That's all very fine at this theoretical level, conceptual level, but how much of that complexity can actually be managed? What do you do with it? Most decision makers or practitioners, they don't want to hear that complexity message. because they can't deal with it. So unfortunately, we don't have all the answers. We have some of the questions, we raise some of the issues, but the next step really is, well, given that we've painted this complex picture, what then are the next steps? How could it work? I'm hoping you're going to come up with the answers. We tried to encapsulate that in short animation, which I'll show you now, I hope. Produced, because for the project we produced a number of different format outputs. No, so not scientific papers as such, we still haven't written those yet, but more, policy briefs and engagement with communities, etc. And we wanted something in a simple form that encapsulated what we'd learned, and this is it. Can we take the lights down a bit in the front? Can I do that from here? Can I? I'll see if this works first. Might not.
It doesn't matter what type of disaster strikes. Flood, earthquake, avalanche, heat wave. They all have one thing in common. They have the potential to impact a community severely, to take a society and expose all its vulnerabilities. That's why community disaster resilience is so important. And we're not just talking about a cliché on the news, about a community bouncing back. It's about having the resources and capacities and fostering the learning and actions which come together in a framework, one that ensures real resilience and real protection. Let me explain. A disaster is a devastating event, but communities can and do recover. But they can't recover by simply turning the clock back. Didn't you learn anything? To recover, to be resilient, a community needs to learn. It needs to adapt, and it needs to understand the risks it faces. It needs institutions as well. Institutions that channel the community's resources and capacities so that resilience is built fairly. These institutions form three strands: civil protection, community involvement, and social protection. Pulling these strands together will reduce vulnerability and lead to real and lasting community resilience. Let's look at the three strands in more detail. What do we mean by civil protection? Two things: the present and the future. In the present, the immediate aftermath, it's about the emergency response. For the future, it's about learning from the experience, about putting effective warning systems in place, about everyone learning and adapting, making sure that what didn't destroy us makes us stronger. Secondly, community involvement. Today, government can't afford to do everything. So the skills, resources, networks and knowledge of the community are increasingly important. The community can help assess and manage its own risks. Recognize everyone's abilities. Make sure that resources are distributed fairly, so everyone has a part to play, from individual citizen to national government. Thirdly, and increasingly, social protection. Making sure that the basic services, the basic safety nets we all take for granted, are restored and renewed. An education system that allows everyone to achieve. An efficient, caring healthcare service. And that everyone has somewhere safe and secure to call home. Resources and capacities, social learning and effective actions brought together in the delivery of civil protection, community involvement and social protection. Together, they'll ensure that no matter how serious the threat, a community can recover and rebuild. That it won't just bounce back, it will bounce forward, stronger, wiser, more prepared, and more resilient. A community that's learned, that's taken action, protected the vulnerable, and made the most of its talents and resources. A truly resilient community.
So we were trying really to tick all of the important elements that we found as we were doing that research. And to give communities also a little bit of leverage for calling for what they needed and how they needed it to be delivered. How they can engage in a much more partnership approach, equal partners, rather than being the people who follow along behind civil protection and support them. As I said, the main project output will be the book, which hopefully will come out this year. In the meantime, there's the website, and the various deliverables are on the website handbook at that link there, and there's a link to it from this as well. So what will it take then to build community resilience, apart from outright social revolution, which is more than a lot of people are bargaining for? For me, I think the resilience concept is here to stay. I mean, it's quite structurally here to stay, at least in the foreseeable future in the UK, in terms of UK resilience. So for me, it's a question of trying to make it work. But it is just a word. It can, and it has been appropriated, but it can also be reclaimed, I think. And it must certainly be contextualized. I think it does need, though, some kind of change, even a radical transformation of organizational culture, which goes beyond this adherence to narrow mandates. And I don't think we have solved that at all. And I came to Christchurch in the hope that they had solved it. And, well, you tell me how effective it's been and what the struggle has been and what the successes are in trying to bring together that very kind of complex petal design. I think it's still a challenge. So that's the challenge now, is having painted that picture, is trying to make it really come alive and happen. So I hope you'll stay for the next bit of this session and to discuss in smaller groups and then back together again how we might do that. So thank you for listening.
Thanks, Maureen. A few more brochures of the e-waste project. You want to have the contact details and everything on the paper. What we can do is a short maybe tea coffee right now before we get answered.
Unless there's any questions people have immediately that I can clarify. Yeah.
Did any of your studies look at affluence and how it is objectives to be accomplished in the absence of
In the absence of funding? It didn't, to be honest, it didn't really look at funding as such. It was looking at how communities were operating and how they got through the various disasters that they'd faced, and they all faced some kind of disaster. And some of them had faced it a long time ago. So in Turkey, we were looking at earthquakes that occurred in 1999, as well as more recently and looked at what were those kinds of factors. But definitely resources came into it of various kinds. However, again, it's that, oh dear, it's the complicated picture again, but even people with resources, so people who were affluent, were still struggling in various ways, and so their affluence didn't totally protect them. So people who had all of the knowledge about the flood risk, well, all of the knowledge, had sufficient knowledge about the flood risk, had quite a few resources, carried out all of the resilience works, did all the community engagement and the advocacy, and still went through it again and were trapped, almost trapped in their affluence, because the insurance either raised the premiums and or the excess level. And so the excess, the amount people have to pay before the insurance money kicks in on their houses, for example, might be £10,000 or £20,000. So, for some people, forget about it. They can't do it. So they're kind of trapped in that, and that's why, in a way, the people who were in the social housing went through it in a better way, because they didn't have that burden, at least. So it's not a simple, if you've got money, you can buy your way out of it. If you've got endless amounts of money, then yeah, probably you can. But generally speaking, it's still quite nuanced.